And so when God says that the decrees in his words need to be with us on the roads, he's saying, I think, one, that they need to be with us at all times. And that two, they need to have some type of public side to it, right? They're not meant to be just hidden in your hearts. They're meant to be displayed, right? They're meant to be kind of seen by others. Next one, when we lie down and when we get up. Now this is interesting because, well, there's a lot of Jewish history that I go into that's kind of boring, so I won't. But the idea that he's going for, I think, is, and that I see, is that you're supposed to kind of bookcase your day with obedience, right? When you lie down, it's right before you go to bed, right before you sleep, right before you get rest. His commands, his decrees, and your responsive obedience is supposed to be there. And then when you get up, your commands, your decree, his commands, his decrees, and your responsive obedience are supposed to be there when you get up, right? When you're about to go into the world and be a part of the larger society, right? And then second to last one, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. We talk about tying and binding. Those are words that, what do you imagine, right? They're being attached to something. They're being almost forced into one thing. And then we talk about tying them on your hands. Hands are, as I'm holding the mic, or if I play guitar, hands are how we interact with the world, how we physically do things. So if his commands, his decrees, and our responsive obedience is supposed to be tied to our hands, what does that mean? We're supposed to have that reflected through our actions. We're supposed to have that reflected in what we do and how we do it. And then bound to our foreheads, right? This is interesting because I think when we think of foreheads, we can either think of like our face, and how people recognize us, or think of it's connected to the mind. And both of those, I think, are good things to think about in terms of our obedience. If we're thinking about how we're identified, we are supposed to be clearly, and Paul goes into this a bunch, we need to be clearly identified as a Christ follower. We're supposed to be set apart. That's what holy means. We're supposed to be set apart from the rest of the world. And if people can't see that by our face, by our identity, then there's something wrong there that we need to check out. And then last one, write them on your door frames of your houses and on your gates. He's not literally saying today, go and do that. Although it's cool if you have little verses, because then it literally reminds you. But that's kind of the goal, the idea that it's going for right here. Is that when you come home to that most vulnerable place, and when people see that, when they come to your house, there should be an identifying mark on you in your household, if they're Christians as well, that you are set apart. And that these decrees are supposed to be a reminder for you as you yourself walk back home, as you yourself unwind from the day. Guys, what he's getting at here throughout the whole thing is that there shouldn't be a break in us following commandments. There shouldn't be a break between saying, God, I love you, in our actions. There shouldn't be a break between Sunday and Wednesday night and the rest of the week. What he's saying is we need to put in the work. We need to have disciplined obedience. And I think that is easy to say, and I think it's painted all over Scripture. But we don't do it, right? I think we can all admit that we have all had those times where we go to church on Sunday, we come to youth group, and we go home. And sometimes it's like a light switch. We're completely different people. Our attitudes are different. Our mentality is different. How we treat people is different. Our words are different. And that's exactly what Deuteronomy and Jesus and what Paul eventually talks about is wrong with us. A huge part that's wrong with us, because there's a disconnect between the title that we have as children of God and our actions and what we actually do to back that up. And I was reading a book about this, and, well, the chapter was about it. And this guy who wrote it, named Jerry Bridges, uses a really cool, I think, illustration for this. And I'm just going to read what he has to say. But, do you guys know what this is?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have some drivers in the room at least. This is a wonderful device called a cruise control. And you use it when you're going on longer road trips and you don't want to hold your foot on the pedal the entire time, right? So you kind of, you press it when you're at the speed you want, and you kind of let your foot off the gas and just chill, right? Pump up the jams and just enjoy your summer drive. And so this is kind of what Bridges uses as his illustration. I'm just going to read a quote. And he says, we tend to obey God in the same way. To continue the driving analogy, we press the accelerator pedal down of obedience until we have brought our behavior to a certain level or speed. The level of obedience is often determined by the behavioral standards of Christians around us. We don't want to lag behind them because we want to be as spiritual as they are. But at the same time, we're not eager to forge ahead of them because we wouldn't want to be different. We want to just comfortably blend in with the level of obedience around us. When I read this, I was like, dang, that describes much of my middle and high school life. And to some extent, my life today. And I think he touches on a couple key points as to why we don't obey him all the time, why we don't let obedience seep into our lives the way that Deuteronomy and the way that Jesus quotes from, and eventually the way that Paul talks about it. I think an aspect to it is the social aspect to it, right? He touched on where you don't want to seem too spiritual. There's times where I've been called too churchy and too fiery, and I'm like, whatever. But that's a real thing, right? We don't want to seem like we're too dedicated because the people around us aren't completely sold out on this whole Christian thing, right? And there's the opposite end of the spectrum, where if you're too far below, people are going to be like, you heathen. And then, insults ensue. So there's those two parts, and I think they combine to form this terrible social mentality that if you are talking about your own obedience, you get this idea that somehow other people form this obedience meter or something that you need to be living up to, or this Christian meter that you need to be living up to. And when we think about that, our idea of a relationship with God becomes people-orientated. It becomes people-motivated. Kind of like in the example with the king. Our motivation for following God is someone else. And that's a problem, like we talked about before, because then our response is not out of love, right? And then there's another part that's detrimental to our mentality, is we look at other people and we say, oh, you're not a Christian, or oh, you're not obeying him like you should, and you start to judge them. You start to see them in different eyes than God sees them, and that's not how a community is supposed to function. That's not how the church is supposed to function, right? And then I think there's an aspect that explains better why we don't do this, and that's the personal aspect. I think one, because we look at that list and we think, oh crap, that's a lot. That's a lot of work, right? We look back to KD, that's a lot of work. To get to college, but even to the NBA level, that's a lot of work. And in order for us to walk with God consistently, and for us to gain this sense of obedience and this idea of what it really means to love God with our entire lives, we have to be disciplined, right? That's the part of disciplined obedience. And discipline basically means that you are self-controlled enough, but you form your habits through what? Time and effort, right? Two things that we don't like to give up and we don't like to get out very easily. Especially sometimes in spiritual disciplines, where honestly, it feels sometimes like there's not a whole lot of return. But that's because we're stupid and have short-term perspectives and all that. So there's that part, and I think the bigger part is that what God requires of us and he asks of us is total abandonment, right? Newsboys has a song, I want to live with abandon, right? If you listen to the lyrics of that song, I think it really well describes what God requires of us, what he asks of us. And he talks about this, Paul talks about this, Galatians 2:20. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul understood total abandon. He understood what it meant to walk with Christ, to obey him, to see him at the authority level that he deserves. And this was his response, guys. That should say something about the seriousness that we should have about it, and it should say something about the dedication and the willpower we have about it. If we go back to the cruise control example, Bridges later in the next paragraph talks about a race car driver. And unfortunately, Chewy's not here tonight, I don't think. But he is our resident race car driver. And Bridges uses this to the dichotomy between these two to describe what Paul and Jesus and Moses back then were talking about. Because if you think about a race car driver, he's not concerned about fitting in with the crowd. He's not concerned about, okay, I'm going to set my speed here and keep it consistent, and I'm not going to go too fast, not going to go too slow, right? The point of a race is to win the race, people, right? The race car driver doesn't care if he's in the pack. He doesn't care if he's looking too fast, right? And then second, he's focused on the finish line. He doesn't care about what do people think about me? What do people identify me with necessarily, right? He's worried about driving that car as fast as possible to the finish line without crashing, right? Hopefully it doesn't crash. And the last thing that a race car driver does is he, in order to get to the finish line the fastest, he pushes his skills and he pushes his car to the limit, right? A race car driver doesn't come into one track and just like hits it off the bat right away. No, he takes practice laps. He knows his car, right? Chewy knows that car really, really well. He doesn't just go out and like do donuts. No, he focuses, he practices, he's disciplined because he wants to win the race. And I think that's what Paul is saying. They didn't have like race cars back then, but Paul talks about the similar idea with walking and running a race. And that's a familiar passage as well, right? Where Paul talks about, we're running this race, and he's not worried about what other people think. He's worried about training himself, and he's worried about the finish line. He's not scared to be different, and he's not scared to put in the work. I think if we look at that in comparison to our Deuteronomy passage, we see this connection, right? We see that Deuteronomy, Moses says, God really says, that obedience needs to be saturated in our lives, that we need to be dedicated to this fully. And then we see Jesus quote this when he's talking to the Sadducees about what's the greatest commandment. Guys, if we're serious about this whole Jesus thing, what he says is the greatest commandment is the greatest commandment, and we should listen, right? And then Paul talks about this. And he says, Paul's in more of a position that we are, right? As part of a church, as part of the post-Christ kind of era, right? And he continues with the same thing. That means that we're kind of up next, right? We are the ones who are expected to be this race car driver. And so, in the end, we have to put in the work if we're going to love God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind. We need the motive, don't get me wrong. We need this foundation. And by no means am I saying that works are going to save you, because they don't. We're saved by grace alone, period. That's all over Scripture. What I'm saying is that if we're serious about God, if we're serious about getting to this finish line, and we're serious about living His purposes out in our lives, then we can't be lazy about it. Because if we're lazy, we put on cruise control, we're just going to keep hitting roadblocks. We're just going to be, oh God, why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? Like, why aren't you speaking to me? Oh, maybe you weren't listening, right? Maybe you weren't looking at what I've already given you to run the race like you need to run it. And maybe I'm holding out my hand, asking you to grab it and run with me. And so, obedience, as we see here, is a key part of loving God. And what that looks like practically is a whole different conversation. And Paul talks a lot about what it means to live a Christian life. And I suggest you read Romans, you read Galatians about that, you read Colossians. But for now, we're actually going to break up into groups. We're going to talk about these three questions. First, how do you know if you have the heart piece? Because if we don't have the heart piece, none of the rest of it matters. It's just doing stuff out of habit, and most likely motivated by something else than love. And so, how do you know if you have the heart piece? AKA, do you understand God's love? Second, what things are keeping you on cruise control? AKA, what is keeping you from responding to God's love in the way that He asks us to, in the way that, honestly, He deserves? And then lastly, what things can help you adopt that race car mentality or race driver mentality, right? How can you practically say, okay, I'm not going to sit on cruise control. I'm going to be serious. I'm going to run the race. I'm going to step my pedal on the gas, step my foot on the gas and go. And I'm just going to go crazy for God. And I'm going to let him, eventually I'm going to let him take the wheel and take me where he wants to go. But I'm going to run that race with him and I'm going to run it hard, right? Because we need to be like KD. We need to see the work that we need to put in and we need to put it in, right? So I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes and we're going to break up and group up with leaders around you and we're just going to talk for some time. Sounds good?
Like sit on the floor here.